This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Some people, when they hear about poetry, they think, well, that's for a few people, and it's too romantic, and maybe I don't understand it every time they say. But I always found that poetry is one of the most powerful ways of saying things. And today we have a real expert in that particular area who has written poetry and who teaches poetry. And I think she will be able to illuminate our general public about what the meaning of poetry is. So Donika Kelly is a native from LA, although she grew up in southern Arkansas. That's a big cultural shift. And she got her bachelor's in art from Southern Arkansas University, her MFA in the University of Texas on Austin, very nice campus. Master's in English and PhD from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. Today, she's an assistant professor of English at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, Baruch College, City University of New York. Welcome to our show, Nika.
So happy to be here.
The first question I have for you is, why poetry? Why do you become interested in poetry? What makes poetry so attractive to you?
When I was in high school, I did not like to write anything at all. I didn't like writing. I loved reading. I loved reading fiction. I didn't read a lot of poetry. But in my senior year of high school over Thanksgiving break, it was a very, very particular moment. I just wrote a little flurry. I had a little explosion of poems. And my high school English teachers read them and encouraged me to keep writing. Those poems were not very good, which is okay because I was in high school. It's not required that they be good, but they did the thing that I wanted them to do, which was I wanted to try to say something about my feelings in a very small space, because my feelings, I think as most young people, I think for everyone, but particularly when one is in high school, the feelings can be really big. And poetry says, what if we just try to contain them a little bit? What if we just try to put a boundary around the feeling? And so I'm really interested in boundaries. I'm really interested in how we can shape feeling in a way that that resonates with other people. Right? So I might be feeling sad, but what is the quality of that sadness? Or I might be feeling very excited and happy and thrilled. What is the nature of that thrill, right? And so the challenge for me in poetry, and this is the thing that I love, is how do I translate my feeling into something that other people can connect to? And I think other artists have something similar, right? I think painters have this. I think sculptors have this. Obviously, other writers have this, right? But I think there's this sort of how can we articulate a moment, a feeling, an idea in a way that will resonate with other people.
Now, you mentioned that there was this experience in high school with a high school teacher. And that's a common thing of many people I interview for this show, is that in most cases when I ask them why they chose this particular career, they say, because I had this teacher, either in high school or in college. You're a teacher yourself. When you stand in front of the class, when you interact with the students, when you prepare a class, to what extent you are conscious the fact that you can also be a very important influence to those students?
I think particularly here at Baruch, but also in some other places, I feel like students are very much wrapped up in they're going to school and they're going to work, and those creative opportunities that are available, that became available to me, for example, in college, might not be on their radar in the same way. And so I feel like the thing that I can do, aside from encouraging them to do their best work, is to also point out other opportunities where they can flourish, other spaces that will nurture their potential. When I was in college, I went to a school that didn't have a writing program. There was one creative writing classes. My professors were wonderful people, but they didn't know a whole lot about creative writing. and I had the opportunity to go to the Bucknell Seminar for Younger Poets, which is amazing. I'm going to get to teach there over the summer as like a faculty. Like it's very strange, but also very exciting. But I remember going there at the age of 20 and not knowing what an MFA program was. And one of the visiting writers, Terrence Hayes, said to me, "Oh, if you got in here, you can get into an MFA program." And I said, "What's an MFA program?" Like I had no idea at all. And that changed the whole course of my life. Like before I went there, I had no idea what an MFA program was. And when I left, I was like, oh, this is the next thing that I'm going to do. And so I feel like I can do that in some ways for my students, talk to them about other possibilities for extending their writing career, other spaces where they can write.
The title of your dissertation, I found it very interesting because he is Reading Against Genre, Contemporary Westerns and the Problem of White Manhood. Tell us what that dissertation was all about.
That dissertation, in some ways, had a very simple. My dissertation had a very simple argument. And the argument was, there were two levels to it. The first level was the one that I often told people, which is that white men are people who have feelings, despite what we have been told, right? And then everyone would laugh, and they would go, "Oh, really?" And I would say, "Yes, really. Like, you know this. You're talking to other people. It's like we know this as a thing." Yeah. But I was interested in how what I consider to be misreadings of Westerns echoed misreadings of masculinity, and in particular white masculinity, where there's an expectation in the Westerns about how genre will work, and sometimes people don't pay attention to the particularities in the scholarship of film. So they say, "Oh no, men don't talk in Westerns." And they just talk and talk and talk. And they might not be talking about things that we consider important or mean, but like there's a lot of talking. And I think it depends on who you're looking at, who one is looking at, who's doing the talking. So I was really interested in how the films, especially contemporary Westerns, sort of pushed against those generic expectations, and how we might use those same strategies of looking and being attentive to talk about white manhood and masculinity. And the point there was not to like rehabilitate white men. That's not my job. The point was to say we can better hold people accountable if we are tracking what they are actually doing, as opposed to what we think they are doing, right? So it could be that like we have an assumption about how men are moving through the world, and that assumption may generally be correct, right? But the particularities are interesting. So I looked at white men who, for example, did not have access to all of like as many resources because they were in a different class, or because they expressed a different sexuality, or their gender expression was a little bit different. And I was like, how does that change their proximity to power? It doesn't mean that they don't have power. It just means it's a little bit different. So like maybe we could be just a little bit more granular in our observations.
Now, this is interesting that you mentioned this, because we have seen in the last few years more Westerns in which there are people of color, and also where women have a different role than the typical John Wayne movies, where the woman was someone's wife and was screaming, or was a prostitute in a saloon or something like that. That brings me to my next question, which is, to what extent is changes in society changing the narrative in movies, or are movies really pioneering some kind of changes of the stereotypes that we have about genre and race?
I think that more recently, Westerns are actually capturing the diversity that existed in the West in the 1800s. And that the role of women in the 1800s was much more complex than the damsel in distress. So I think Westerns are actually becoming in some ways more realistic in terms of the populations that lived in the American West, right? And so that's more interesting, but I think that's definitely a reaction or a response to a moment where people are asking, audiences are asking, for more representation, right? To actually see characters who are not white men exclusively, like in a film. And so we have something like Denzel Washington's Magnificent Seven, right? Yes. Where, like he's the one who's leading the group of men, right? And forgive me, it's been a while since I've seen that one, but I did see it. Yeah. But there is for me something about the American West and what is possible there that feels compelling, and that it makes sense that people went west to seek fortune or to change a larger narrative, right? Women were able to vote, right? White women were able to vote in the American West before they were able to vote out here in the Northeast. And that's because those structures, those social structures were newer, right? So there's something about that I find interesting and compelling. Also probably because I'm from the West, which I forget. Sometimes. I'm like, oh, yeah, Los Angeles, the West.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, we earlier mentioned how powerful poetry can be because in few words you can send such a huge message, and you see it in many poets. But I think it's also interesting for me, and I like poetry, but what I prefer to do is to listen to the author of the poem reading the poem. And I don't know if you agree with me or not, but there's always a big difference when you hear it from the author, him or herself, or just reading it. Do you think that it conveys some kind of different context or even message?
I think that it is possible, yes, that when the author reads their work, we are given something qualitatively different in terms of an experience. I don't know. So yesterday I met with a student and she brought in her poem. And she said when she read it, it didn't sound as good. And then I read it and she was like, oh. She was like, maybe it's just me, right? Like when someone is good at reading, when someone has skill at reading and performing their own work, that can be so powerful. But not everyone has that skill. Not everyone cultivates it, right? And so I don't know. I think there is something that comes with that. I also think when we hear authors read, especially I showed my class recently a poet reading at a bookstore. So like the bookstore had recorded in very high quality the reading, and we watched it in class because there was a Q&A after. Okay. And I wanted them to sort of see like how a poet responds, right, to questions on the fly, like from an audience, And I thought that was really helpful to know that like poets are out here in the world, we're writing. You can ask us questions. We sometimes have answers to those questions, sometimes we don't. Right.
Yeah. Okay. So let's experience this right now because I asked you to bring some of your poetry here for you to read. Can you tell us the title of the poem and the extract that you're going to be reading about? What the poem in general is all about, and what's the title?
Okay. So the title of the poem that I'm going to read today is called Love Poem Chimera, and it's from my first collection, which is titled Bestiary.
And actually, to those of you who are watching us via video, this is the cover of the book.
And I actually got to see. So this is an image from a medieval bestiary from the 1400s, and it's the text is or the image is titled "Adam Names the Animals." And so a bestiary is a collection of, it's like a kind of encyclopedia, almost a religious encyclopedia of both mythological and real animals. And and bestiaries often have like a moral component to them, right? So there's a Christian sort of thrust in most bestiaries, even when dealing with mythological animals. And so the poem that I'm reading is titled Love Poem Chimera. It's from a series of love poems with a similarly structured title, Love Poem, and then some kind of mythological animal. So there are satyrs, there are centaurs, there are mermaids, there are minotaurs. Because I was trying to think about how to be a person, how to be human, or to understand my own humanity in a cultural moment where I am often told, perhaps not as strongly as people like me have been told in the past, that I'm not a person, that I don't count fully in my personhood. And so I wanted to take, or I sort of intuitively took some different routes to get at how to understand being a person. And so these love poems came out of that process, out of that thinking process.
Okay, so go ahead.
All right. So love poem Chimera. I thought myself lion and serpent, thought myself body enough for two, for we, found comfort in never being lonely. What burst from my back, from my bones, what lived along the ridge, from crown to crown, from mane to forked tongue beneath the skin. What clamor we made in the birthing, what hiss and rumble at the splitting, at the horns and beard, at the glottal bleat. What bridges our back, what strong neck, what bright eye, what menagerie are we, what we've made of ourselves.
You know, I going to ask you to leave me, or I'm going to buy a copy of that book, because I think that's very profound, but it needs like several readings before you really get into it, right?
Well, it's helpful if you know, and I meant to say this earlier, it's helpful, I think, if you know that the chimera that I'm talking about, because there are a few iterations in Greek mythology, but the one that I'm thinking of has the body of a lion, right? So it's a head, body is a lion, the tail is a serpent that ends in like a snake's head. And then in the middle of the back is a goat's head. And I remember looking at that and just being like, how do we get that?
Yes.
Right? Like, how do we get to the goat's head? Because there's something that kind of makes sense about the lion with the serpent tail, because a serpent is kind of like a tail, right? But the goat's head didn't make any sense at all. And so I was thinking about that, and I was also thinking about family, right? That, like, families are kind of like that. Like, they make a kind of sense, but also they don't really make sense, right? Like, we are just born into these organizations, right? These small groups, and then we just live together, and we're responsible to and for each other. It's like, how does that happen? Like, why is sure, yeah. Okay, but like whenever I put even a little bit of pressure on that concept, it just gets very strange. The concept of family, of birth family, I don't know. It's weird. I find it strange. So,
that reminds me a phrase by a philosopher I heard once that he said, "I am myself and my circumstance." And at the beginning, I thought, this is a very pretentious person that seems to be dominating. But what he really was meaning was, I am who I am, plus the environment that has made me. And it sounds like when it comes to a family, you have these two influences from the paternal side and the maternal side. And do you feel that in some way that kind of things create this chimera where you are part something or part other, or something along those lines?
Yeah, I often think with I look at my parents and, like, for the most part, they make sense together. You know, and my brother and my sister, I feel like they make sense in our family. But I have definitely felt a little bit like the goat's head in the middle of the back, where I'm just like, how did I get here? We all have, I think, to some degree, similar interests. We all get bored very easily, like every single one of us. Like, we get bored so easily. Yeah. So work is challenging, trying to find work that will stimulate us. My brother and my sister make art that they then listen to, right? So they make songs and then they listen to their own songs. I write poems and then I read my poems to other people, right? So we're self-referential in that way. But I left, and my family all lives in the same town in Arkansas, right? And there's something about that leaving and sort of breaking, or at least bending, some of those bonds that makes our relationship feel a little bit strained, right? I don't understand how they work. I don't know what they do. I don't understand the choices that they make. But I think it's similar. I think, like, they look at me and they're like, sure. Yeah. Okay, you know.
Now, do you think that among all creative people, maybe people who write poems, require like an extra sense of introversion to understand yourself. So when you are communicating these things, you really are feeling, because by listening to the reading that you just made, I felt that you were expressing a lot of internal feelings and sentiments. So I wonder, it's not like someone in other profession that just does things, but you really have to express a lot of what you have internally, not just talking about the world.
I think that's true for some poets, right? I think that the poets who I get excited about, the largest group of poets who I get excited about are poets who have that interest in the self, right? Who are sort of rooting around in their own materials to sort of make art, right? But then there are poets who are poets of witness, right? There are poets who are interested in seeing the world and describing to us the world from their perspective. And I think that that's also really important. Yesterday in class, we read, in translation, obviously, Pablo Neruda's I Explain a Few Things.
One of my favorites, yeah.
Yeah. And we read I Explain a Few Things from Spain in Our Hearts, right, which he wrote during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s.
Yes.
And that moment, both according to him and to the Norton, right? But like that marked for him a shift from a poet who was writing about his, like love. I mean, he still did these things, right? But who's writing about love and about landscape and about relationships to a poet who was writing more publicly, right? Who was like, we need to look at the conflict in the world. We need to look at the people who are vulnerable. We need to attend to how war changes things, right? And that I think poets need both of those. Like I'm trying to figure out how to write about the moment that we're in politically, culturally, but I'm also deeply interested in myself. And so it's like, how does one balance that, right? Like, how do we balance, as artists, the interest in the self and the responsibility to respond to what is happening in the times in which we are living?
By the way, the first time I realized how different it sounds a poem when you read it versus the author reading to you was with Pablo Neruda. Because I read it in high school, but when I saw him and heard him reading, it sounded like there much more to it than I thought it was into that. Now, you were talking about love, and I saw that many of your poems have the love theme in there. Why is that?
I love love. No, that's an easy answer. I mean, that is true. That's a true answer.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in the complexity of love. If I could, I would just write love poems, because love to me is so complex and so it's more than the sort of romantic eros, the sort of hot flash of passion, right? What does sustainable love look like? What does it look like to so I don't know. So in my family, for example, I don't talk to my dad. And I'm very open about this. Like, I don't think that he's a very good person. But I love him. Like, I love my dad. I want him to be okay. I just don't want to have to talk to him. And if I were to talk to him, the way that I would feel compelled to do so would not be in a loving way. And so in that relationship, love looks like me not talking to him, because it's the way that I can continue to be respectful. I can wish him well, but we don't have to interact. That's love, right? But it's not the same love that I have for my mom, or the same love that I have for my friends, or the same love that I have for my partner, or the love that I have for people, right? Sort of generally and broadly construed, right? Or like my students' work. Like when I love my students' work and I get really jazzed, like they can tell, And when I see that promise, they can tell, right? I try to communicate that to them as well. But I feel like love is, it's much more, there's much more depth to it than we often give the concept, especially in poetry, credit for. Like the love poems that are in this collection, in this book, are breakup poems. So it's like, how can I break, like I was breaking up with someone and writing these poems in response to that. And it was like, how can I do this in a loving and respectful way, right? Like, how can I do that? in a way that isn't like angry or yelling. Or I had some bad models. So I was like, how can I make new models for how to do this? Because I still love that person, right? We just couldn't be together. We couldn't be in the same space.
That's interesting that you say that, because people in your generation, something that was totally unimaginable in mine, are breaking up over the internet.
I've not ever done that. I've not ever done that.
No, but what I'm saying is there's a different concept about communicating that type of things these days that it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So it's interesting you mentioned that. Yeah. Oh, I saw that you wrote a poem titled Renga for Obama.
Oh,
I was intrigued. What was that poem is all about?
So the Renga for Obama was actually a large collaborative project that I was a part of. And so a Renga is, how to say, it's like a Japanese poetic collaborative form, right? So it blends the haiku, right, which is the 575. And then there are 2 lines that are 7 syllables each. So the structure of each entry into the Renga is the haiku and then the response.
Okay.
Right? And so I was paired up with another poet, Brian Turner. And we were like way in the middle. Like there were like, I think over 100 poets participating in this. So I was just one of many, many people. And so he wrote the haiku, which I think is the harder part. And then I responded to his haiku. And the project was conceived by, this is so embarrassing. I think it was Major Jackson, who conceived of the project. And what he wanted to do was to have poets reflect on the magnitude of the first Black president, right, and that administration. And the goal was not like they were very explicit in these guidelines. The goal was not to be critical, but we also weren't expected to write, hagiography, right? It wasn't just like, oh, Obama's great. And so the form sort of gave us a lot of flexibility to think about how to say or convey a mood or a tone in a very short space. And it was also quite collaborative. And so I think over the course of many weeks, every day a new poem came out. And I think mine was in April, sometime in April with Brian. And it was really cool to be a part of that process.
Yes, pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Well, we are running out of time, so I have a last question for you. What is your next big project? What are you working on?
Well, there's the project that I am wrapping up, which is a book-length collection. It looks at, how to say, it's so sad. It looks at the end of a long-term relationship, right? The speaker in the collection has, like, her marriage is ending at the same time that she is confronted with dealing with childhood sexual abuse, like sort of memories and trauma of that. So that's one project, and that's pretty far along in terms of being complete. The other project that I'm working on, I'm in the very early stages. I'm looking at whales, squid, octopus. I'm thinking about memory. I want to write about the women in my family. My mom, my sister, my grandma, my great-grandma, whose lives are complex and interesting and were different from mine. And I just want to spend some time with them because I think that'll actually be less sad than this other project, which is quite sad. Okay. So,
well, sounds very interesting. So thank you very much to Donika Kelly, who we have a very interesting conversation about poetry, poems, and many other things. And for next episode of College Talk, we're going to have another of our faculty members coming here to talk about issues that are concerning us today. So stay tuned.
Thank you.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences. All rights reserved, 2018.